Almost 400 years ago, two French explorers, Samuel de Champlain and Pierre de Gasse, sailed from France for the New World. After many weeks at sea, they came upon the coast of what is now Nova Scotia. To the tired, lonely sailors, the beautiful coastline reminded them of their home, Cape de LaHave, which they had watched fade out of sight at the start of their unpredictable journey. And so it was that the new land was named. Though they would move on to found the settlement at Port Royal, the name LaHave remained as a testament of their first land sighted. Many years passed, and it was not until 1632 that an expedition led by Isaac de Razilly, who, selected by the French to take possession of Acadia from the English, set up residence at LaHave. Between that time and his death a few years later, he brought out settlers from France to carry on the fisheries and farm the land.
Among the flash explorers and the fortune hunters, with their shiny uniforms, I feel a patriarch, coming like this, with seed and cow and priest. Soil worries me, and crops and weather, threat of long winters. As my ship moves to the river mouth, I stand, hand on rigging, and my heart leaps, for I conjure up a fort, and cottages, and plots along the shore. Oxen plodding, children on school benches, and church bells ringing on holy, quiet Sundays. This land I dedicate to Mary, Gracia Plena, as a safe and solid haven for my people and the heart of a new world of France.
He did build his fort on a hillock of land of 3 or 4 acres, the ruins of which can be seen today at Fort Point, 12 miles below Bridgewater on the LaHave River. The families settled by Razilly were later moved to Port Royal. Numerous mentions of LaHave in official reports of that time show that it was considered a place of great importance. It had an excellent harbor, was important to the fisheries, was near enough for piracy on the English colonies, and was nearer to France than other settlements. The area became a mixture of immigrants with the addition of Germans from the Lunenburg area. In time, these settlers spread by steps up the river, and the geography of the land decreed that the area now called Bridgewater should be the site of a town. It was far enough inland, 15 miles from the sea, to be a safe harbor, was the head of navigation. A number of streams tumbling down the hills to the river had great power possibilities, and mill sites were much sought-out spots in the land being hewn out of the wilderness. Bridgewater did not develop very rapidly. In fact, for a long time it could not be rightly called a settlement. Ruins of old mills on streams at the shipyards in the north and south ends of the town suggest that these districts developed independently, as did also the settlements on the road by the west bank of the river. Between the settlements at the north and south, and rising up behind the street by the river, was a great high hill, which was a major obstacle to the establishment of a compact community. A prime factor in drawing these parts together was the first bridge laid across the river at its narrowest point, slightly above the site of the present bridge. It was erected in 1825 by Archer and Nicholson. Bridge building was hard and heavy work in those days, when machines could not be substituted for brawn. The men worked hard and lived hard. At the time the first bridge was constructed, men drank on the job to such an extent that in many cases their liquor debt overbalanced their wages. And so much time was being lost by the frequent trips to the tavern that a liquor shed was built at the bridge site As an inducement to stimulate endeavor and establish an atmosphere of neighborliness, a dozen kegs of Jamaica rum are said to have been swilled by workmen and interested spectators, of which there were not a few. This bridge lasted for 20 years and then was replaced by another one of cribwork style. Then in 1891, at a cost of just over $23,000, yet another bridge was built but was taken out by a giant ice floe on St. Valentine's Day in 1971. After its quick repair, the calls for a second bridge grew too loud to ignore. Thus, the present four-lane construction was completed in 1984. Much better could be said for those people who wrestled their living from the land and water of the town. They worked hard. Women took their places with the men on the land, despite rearing large families. They also had to spin, weave, knit, and sew. Men cleared and tilled the soil, with or without the help of oxen. With axes and a few crude tools, they built their dwellings and often raised the barn before the house, fashioned their vehicles, built their ships, or bridged their roads. Of these early settlers, it was often said they were tenacious of opinion and often obstinate, took great interest in party politics, and would follow their leaders with an unwarranted confidence. One such old-timer, who could neither read nor write, was quoted as saying, "That a liberal and a Lutheran I was born, and a liberal and a Lutheran I will die, because and because." As early as 1757, a road had been cut from Halifax to Lunenburg so that Lunenburg could get mail directly by land as well as by sea. The first mail, carried once a week on horseback, then by wagon, later gave way to stagecoach. The coach traveled the old road from Halifax to Mahone, then by way of a new road built in 1858 to Bridgewater, across the bridge and on to Liverpool. With the opening of the road from Mahone to Liverpool, Bridgewater received a great boom in prosperity. Men with their families moved to the town to get steady employment. Houses were built, new roads were opened, and ships lined the river transporting lumber. Shipping, shipbuilding, and lumber were the prime staples of the time in Bridgewater. Sawmills and lumbering businesses provided a thriving export industry, with goods and cargo coming and going to Argentina, Scandinavia, New England, New York, the West Indies, and South America.
These boats traveled the world and took lumber products and after the railway products from the interior of Nova Scotia elsewhere to ports in the West Indies and different parts of the world, and then returned with sugar, molasses, and those kinds of import items that this community needed but couldn't provide for itself here in Lunenburg County.
By 1873, some 30 sawmills were in operation along the banks of the LaHave. But the largest in the area, and said to be one of the largest in the country, was the Davison Lumber Mill, employing 350 men and using over 50 teams of oxen.
Davison lumbering operations was very important business to this town, employed hundreds of people, and it operated into this century. It was purchased by an American firm, and they operated until 1921 when the market just was a glut on the market. And they extended, this operation extended into the hinterland, followed the river to its mouth. A railway was established along the route to bring logs and lumber in, and a very large mill was established in Annapolis County. The Davison lumbering operation was the biggest lumbering operation in the country at its time.
The industrial center of the town was then called Sebastopol, and at the time was a thriving business section. Ox carts were stopped by the road, while their owners did business at Hunter's Iron Factory, Waterman's Tannery, Whitney's Grist Mill, or McKay's General Store. One of the more interesting industries at Sebastopol was the carding mill built by Mr. Dean Weil to handle the processing of wool from the area farmers in preparation for its subsequent spinning. With little money, it is said that capital for the mill came from the efforts of Weil himself, who traveled from village to village, giving singing lessons for 5 cents. Weil's mill was one of 77 carding mills in Nova Scotia, and like all mills of the time, was water-powered. They shared the brook that powered his business with 2 grist mills, a tannery, a foundry, carriage factory, and 2 sawmills.
The mill was very successful for several reasons. The prices were reasonable, and he also worked on the barter system, whereas if you didn't have the cash for the carding cost, he'd take just about anything that he could resell to the townspeople. And he also carded your wool individually, whereas in many of the mills this wasn't done. So if you had very good quality wool, you would definitely get it back in the end of processing. Carding is just combing the wool. Just as if you were getting up in the morning, your hair was tangled, and you combed it with your own comb. It's done with a set of hand cards, and when you move them in opposite directions, you get a resistance, which just combs the wool out. And once the fibers are all going in one direction, when you spin them together, they're going to form a nice, strong piece of material instead of breaking off on you when you're trying to spin.
By 1884, a pound of wool could be picked and carded for about 5 cents, and most customers' transactions were under $1. Weil's 2 sons, Arkanis and Otto, later worked with him, and by the mid-1880s, the Weil carding mill was clearing about $900 a year, a substantial income for the time. But when Otto's son Vernon inherited the mill in 1936, there was only enough business to keep it in operation part-time, yet it continued to card wool until its close in 1968. The first election for councillors for the municipality was in 1879, and both Lunenburg and Bridgewater made repeated bids for the honor of Shiretown. It can be readily imagined how a slight majority in favor of Bridgewater could throw everything her way, and this seems to be the explanation for Bridgewater being chosen in 1892 as the site of the Lunenburg County Exhibition, a yearly event where people from all over would gather to display livestock, farm goods, and homemade articles of food and clothing. Much has changed since 80-year-old ox teamster Henry Young climbed a hay wagon to ride the 8 miles to his first exhibition.
My first that I took any animals there, I was 14 years old. That's 66 years ago. This year, they used to have the exhibition in September at that time. My father used to take oxen. Well, then that year I had a pair of calves and a bow yoke. We used to break them in a bow yoke. I don't know what it means, I guess. And there was 3 of us young fellows around this settlement here. We took our calves down. We walked them. We used to put what they called the hay racks on the wagon, fill all the hay in bags, load that in, and then my mother would bake up a lot of food. The exhibition was 4 days. And we'd put that on and haul that in, take some bedding with. They had what they called it was a bunkhouse where you would go in and stay. It was a place that the men slept, and they took their trunks in there full of food, and that's the way we made it at that time.
The name was later changed to the South Shore Exhibition, and today is heralded as one of the finest agricultural events in Canada, and draws thousands of people to its week-long celebration. This year is one of particular interest, as it is celebrating its centennial year. The late 1800s saw the town of Bridgewater well on its way to becoming a thriving force of power and influence in the province. A railroad had been constructed from Middleton to Lunenburg, with a branch from Bridgewater to Liverpool. With the completion of lines running from New Germany to Caledonia and from Liverpool to Halifax, Bridgewater became the center where crew changes were made and new trains were made up. Also, it was in Bridgewater that the roundhouse was built to repair the great locomotives of the day. However, in the early 20s, the roundhouse was destroyed by fire, and as well, the stately 93-year-old station itself, which was the pride of the town for many years, would later suffer the same fate in 1982. By 1890, The Bridgewater Power Company had been established by local men, and a power plant run by coal was operational. The power from this plant was used to light the main street, the lampposts being set in a wooden sidewalk. As well, men spoke with pride of the new music hall, a spacious square building erected on the site of the present post office. However, when the new year of 1899 was only 12 days old, the little town experienced the worst catastrophe in its short history. Shortly after midnight, on January the 12th, 1899, a fire, which started in one of the two stores below the auditorium of the music hall, swept down the main street. The night was very cold, the wind very high. People were awakened by the light of the blaze, which lit the scene so brilliantly that pictures taken by it even showed the ice cakes floating down the river. The local firemen toiled all night. Lunenburg sent an engine and men to assist, and men were called from surrounding districts to help fight the blaze. By morning, the flames had died. On both sides of the main street, not one building remained. Smoldering heaps of ashes marked the spots where they had stood, one against the other without a break. No one perished in the blaze, but the next morning, one of the merchants who had suffered greatly by the fire was struck by a team and killed. The first mayor of the town, which was incorporated 1 month later, was quoted as saying,
"The situation was so depressing after the fire, and the work of rebuilding the whole business section of the town such an undertaking that we can only wonder how it was so thoroughly performed in just 6 months. The 5 buildings, which have been erected in such a solid modern style and at reasonable cost, will only go to prove our townspeople are determined to enjoy all the latest improvements of civilized town life."
One of the first acts of the newly formed town council was to buy the land on Main Street along the bank of the river, thus preventing another fire trap. A single row of small maple trees were planted on this ground, forming a stately boulevard, which shaded the street from morning sun and gave Bridgewater one of the finest main streets in the province. From that time on saw a surge in the vitalization in the downtown area. Some 40 fire hydrants were installed. Water, sewage, and electric light systems were extended from the center of town out in all directions. Wooden sidewalks were torn up and replaced with gravel, some curbed with granite. Each year saw new streets extended. The residential boundaries and cow paths became thoroughfares, and wooden bridges gave way to concrete. The war years, ironically, are the boom years. People make money easily, and people spend money readily. The boom that hit Bridgewater was no exception and lasted to the mid-1920s. It was responsible for many of the fine buildings and industries in the area. The Empire Theater, the LaHave Milling Company, and the Bridgewater Shipping Company, to name a few. After the war, industry continued to grow, with the Acadia Gas Company becoming the largest manufacturer of two-cycle gas engines in Canada, and then the opening of the only hospital on the South Shore. With the beginning of the World War, the town was once again called to rally its people together, and with the exhibition grounds being used as a military training center, the local train station saw many a doughboy shipped out for active duty. With the Depression following the end of the war, the town's boom fell sharply. Building operations fell off, funding for the new businesses cut, and many industries closed their doors. And it was not until the end of the Second World War that Bridgewater reached a resemblance of the prosperity she had known in the past. Similarly to the other war, it had brought an influx of people and growth that had not been seen before, and continued to grow in leaps and bounds. Today's Bridgewater is very different. The river is still here, of course, timeless and deep, flowing through the lives of Bridgewater's present inhabitants as it did through the lives of its forefathers, and perhaps just as important. From humble beginnings, Bridgewater today is a bustling, thriving town with much to offer residents and tourists alike. And like the Bridgewater of yesterday, the town's greatest resource may very well be its cheerful, hard-working people. The upper reaches of the LaHave River each year beckon salmon anglers from across the Atlantic region to such places as Indian Falls, Daphne's Run, and the Mink Hole to challenge their skill on some of the best salmon fishing in the world. Industry, as in the past, has continued to play a major role in the area. In October of 1971, Michelin Tire Canada Limited opened a plant in Bridgewater to manufacture car and light truck tires, employing over 3,000 people. Commerce in the area has done equally well with the building of the Bridgewater Mall in 1975 and expansion in 1989. With over 74 stores and services, together with the East Side Court adjacent to the mall, they employ over 1,000 people. It has made a major impact on the town since its inception. Though many years have come and gone since Champlain first named these rugged shores, there is one thing that time alone cannot change, that being the magnificent beauty of the land he called LaHave. And so to him and the settlers who came later, we say thank you, for these indeed were our pioneers to prosperity.